Commander Sarah Mitchell was pinned down in a concrete bunker, watching her extraction window close with each passing minute, when she heard the distant thunder of rotor blades cutting through the morning air. What she didn't know was that the pilot racing toward her position had been grounded for months after questioning orders that cost lives. Sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected sources, and sometimes the person everyone has written off is exactly the person who refuses to write you off. The predawn mist clung to the concrete landing pad at Naval Air Station Oceana like a shroud, wrapping around the silent aircraft that sat in perfect formation under the amber security lights. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Captain Jessica Phoenix Rodriguez stood at the edge of the flight line, her hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee that had long since lost its ability to provide comfort. The steam rising from the liquid mixed with her visible breath. In the cold Virginia morning, creating small clouds that dissipated as quickly as her chances of getting back into a cockpit. Around her, the controlled chaos of pre-mission preparation unfolded with the precision of a well-rehearsed symphony. Ground crews swarmed over a H-1Z Viper attack helicopters, checking weapon systems, fuel loads, and communication arrays. The metallic scrape of tools against aircraft skin, mixed with the low rumble of auxiliary power units and the sharp commands of crew chiefs, ensuring every detail met operational standards. Phoenix watched it all from the sidelines, close enough to smell the aviation fuel and hydraulic fluid that had been the perfume of her professional life, but far enough away to remind everyone of her current status. In her left hand, she clutched the same thing she'd been carrying for the past 8 months. Not a flight helmet or tactical gear, but a manila folder containing administrative reviews, disciplinary reports, and endless documentation of why Captain Jessica Rodriguez was no longer considered suitable for combat aviation. The irony wasn't lost on her that the folder was thicker than most mission briefing packages, representing more paperwork than she'd generated during 12 years of active flight operations. Phoenix had accumulated over 2,800 flight hours in attack helicopters, including 847 combat hours across 3 deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq. She'd mastered every weapon system the Marine Corps had put in front of her, excelled in close air support operations that saved countless ground units, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to read battlefield dynamics from the air. She could identify enemy positions by the way shadows fell across terrain features, predict insurgent movement patterns based on local population behaviors, and deliver precision fires in urban environments where a single mistake could cause catastrophic civilian casualties. But none of that expertise mattered to the review board that had recommended her removal from flight status after she'd questioned orders that led to a friendly fire incident 6 months earlier. The investigation had ultimately vindicated her tactical assessment, but not before her career had been derailed by officers who viewed her challenges to conventional wisdom as insubordination rather than professional expertise. "Phoenix," called out Major Tom Harrison from across the flight line, his voice carrying that familiar mixture of sympathy and awkwardness that had become the soundtrack to her exile from operational flying. "Command's got you handling the mission support. Documentation again. Hope those numbers add up right, or we might have to explain some creative accounting to the Pentagon." His wingman, Captain Mike Foster, chuckled without looking up from his pre-flight inspection. "Maybe they'll promote her to senior flight planning specialist next. That's some serious responsibility right there, managing all those spreadsheets and logistics reports." Phoenix didn't respond to their condescending banter. She'd learned months ago that defending herself only provided ammunition for those who questioned her emotional stability and professional judgment. Instead, she focused on the mission board where today's operation was displayed in colored overlays, Across a detailed topographical map of the Helmand province in Afghanistan, 2 SEAL teams were being inserted for a high-value target capture mission in mountainous terrain that presented significant challenges for both insertion and extraction. She knew those mountains better than anyone on the base. During her off-duty hours over the past months, she'd studied every ridgeline, every valley approach, every seasonal weather pattern that affected visibility and aircraft performance in that specific region. She'd cross-referenced geological surveys with historical battle damage assessments and identified dozens of alternative routes that could be used for emergency extraction or tactical advantage if primary plans failed. Phoenix had compiled detailed analyses of how morning thermal currents affected helicopter performance at different altitudes, how seasonal dust patterns reduced visibility along conventional approach corridors, and where enemy forces typically positioned anti-aircraft weapons based on terrain advantages. She'd presented her findings to Colonel David Warren, the Air Operations Commander, hoping to contribute something more meaningful than administrative tasks. But Warren had dismissed her work as excessive preparation from someone with too much time on her hands, reminding her that mission planning was handled by current operational pilots who understood the realities of combat flying. Her comprehensive tactical analysis had been filed away in the base's digital archive system, labeled as theoretical work that had no practical application to current operations. Colonel Warren strode past her position now, his polished flight boots clicking against the concrete as he headed toward the operations center where real decisions were made about aircraft deployment and pilot assignments. His acknowledgement of her presence consisted of a brief glance at the folder in her hands, confirming that she was exactly where he expected her to be, handling paperwork while others prepared for missions that mattered. The mountainous terrain of Helmand province shimmered in her memory like a three-dimensional map she could navigate with her eyes closed. Phoenix could visualize the approach corridors that morning thermal activity would make turbulent, the ridgelines where enemy observers typically positioned themselves, and the hidden valleys that provided natural concealment for aircraft movement. She'd grown up in similar terrain in Colorado, spending her childhood exploring mountain wilderness with her father, who'd taught her to read landscape features like a survival manual. That knowledge, combined with her extensive combat experience, gave her insights that went far beyond what appeared on standard aviation charts. She could predict how seasonal weather patterns would affect different flight altitudes, where enemy forces would likely position anti-aircraft weapons, and which routes provided the best combination of concealment and tactical flexibility. But the command structure wasn't interested in unconventional expertise from someone whose official status was administrative support rather than operational pilot. Through the base perimeter fence, she could see the shapes of the 4 Hu-1Z Vipers that would provide close air support for today's SEAL insertion. Each aircraft was armed with the latest precision weapons and equipped with advanced targeting systems. But Phoenix knew that technology meant nothing if you didn't understand the environmental factors that could turn a routine mission into a disaster. The planned flight routes followed standard approach patterns that prioritized fuel efficiency and radio communication range, exactly what any competent enemy force would expect and prepare to counter. Phoenix had identified alternative approaches that used terrain masking and thermal management to reduce aircraft signatures, but those recommendations were buried in archive files that nobody bothered to review. "Rodriguez," a voice called from behind her. She turned to see Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Kim approaching, the only senior officer on the base who'd ever shown genuine interest in her tactical observations. Kim was a logistics specialist who'd worked with Phoenix on several base security assessments and had witnessed her encyclopedic knowledge of aviation tactics firsthand. "This is insane," Kim said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "You should be leading one of those flights, not standing here with a folder full of administrative reports." You know that terrain better than anyone, including the pilots who've never flown combat missions in Afghanistan. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Phoenix shrugged, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the manila folder. Orders are orders, Colonel. My job is to make sure the administrative documentation is properly maintained and filed according to regulations. Administrative documentation, Kim whispered fiercely. Everyone knows you've analyzed every square mile of that operational area. Remember that tactical assessment you completed 4 months ago? You identified 23 alternative approach routes that nobody else had even considered. What happened to that analysis? The memory hit Phoenix like a physical blow. The comprehensive flight route analysis had been her attempt to contribute something meaningful to base operations, despite her grounded status. She'd spent weeks studying satellite imagery, weather data, and historical engagement reports to create a detailed guide to unconventional flight patterns that could provide tactical advantages in the specific terrain where today's mission would unfold. The report had included seasonal wind patterns, enemy weapons placement probabilities, and aircraft performance considerations that could be crucial for both successful insertion and emergency extraction scenarios. Colonel Warren had reviewed the document for approximately 15 minutes before filing it away, as interesting but impractical for current operational requirements. The detailed route maps Phoenix had created were labeled as excessive detail and archived where they would be forgotten until the next administrative review cycle. That was just theoretical work, Phoenix said, though her voice lacked conviction. The kind of analysis you do when you have too much time on your hands and not enough real responsibilities. Theoretical work that might actually save lives. Today, Kim replied, nodding toward the flight crews conducting their final equipment checks. Look at those planned routes, Jessica. They're following the same approaches every mission uses. If there's anti-aircraft positions waiting, those helicopters are going to fly right into an ambush. Phoenix checked her watch and looked at the mission timeline attached to her folder. The SEAL insertion was scheduled to begin in 45 minutes, following flight paths that would take the aircraft through terrain she'd studied extensively. She thought about the alternative approaches she'd identified, the hidden corridors that could provide tactical advantages or emergency escape routes if the primary mission plan encountered unexpected resistance. But her job wasn't flight planning or tactical consultation. Her job was ensuring that administrative paperwork was properly completed and filed according to Marine Corps regulations. The disconnect between her capabilities and her assignments had become a source of constant frustration. But questioning orders wasn't an option for someone already considered a problem pilot by the command structure. A sharp whistle cut through the morning air, signaling the final preparation phase for the day's operation. Phoenix watched as the flight crews gathered around their aircraft, conducting last-minute systems checks and reviewing their assigned routes. These were competent pilots, well-trained and professional, but they were about to venture into terrain that held secrets only she fully understood. The base radio crackled with routine communications as the aircraft prepared for departure. Weather conditions were favorable. Satellite intelligence showed no obvious threats along the planned routes, and all systems were functioning within normal parameters. Everything looked perfect for a routine insertion mission that would place 2 SEAL teams in position to capture a high-value target who'd been evading coalition forces for months. But Phoenix had learned that in mountainous terrain, routine was often an illusion that lasted only until the first surface-to-air missile left its launcher. She'd seen too many missions go wrong when aircraft followed predictable patterns that enemy forces could anticipate and counter with devastating effectiveness. The sound of rotor blades spinning up filled the air as the H-1Z Vipers prepared for departure. Phoenix stood at her assigned position near the operations building, watching through the chain-link fence as aircraft that should have been under her command lifted off into the Afghan morning. The lead pilot was Captain James Sullivan, a competent aviator who'd completed 2 tours, but had never flown in the specific terrain where today's mission would unfold. Sullivan was following the standard approach route that prioritized radio communication with ground forces and fuel efficiency over tactical considerations that Phoenix considered fundamental to survival in hostile airspace. The planned flight path would take his formation directly over several ridgelines where enemy observers could track their movement for miles, providing ample time to coordinate anti-aircraft responses. Phoenix had identified alternative routes that used natural terrain features to mask aircraft movement, approaches that would require more fuel and precise navigation, but would dramatically reduce the aircraft's visibility to enemy forces. Those recommendations were now sitting in digital files that nobody had bothered to integrate into operational planning, theoretical work that was about to become tragically practical. The 4 Vipers lifted off in perfect formation, their rotor wash kicking up clouds of dust that swirled across the landing pad in geometric patterns that reminded Phoenix of the atmospheric disturbances she'd studied in her weather analysis. Each aircraft carried a full load of ammunition and precision weapons, enough firepower to support the SEAL teams through any reasonable level of resistance they might encounter. But reasonable resistance was a concept that didn't account for enemy forces who had months to study coalition flight patterns and prepare countermeasures, specifically designed to exploit the predictability of standard military procedures. Phoenix had analyzed intelligence reports that suggested insurgent forces in the target area had acquired sophisticated anti-aircraft weapons, surface-to-air missiles that could engage targets at ranges far beyond anything the mission planners had considered. As the helicopters disappeared into the morning haze, Phoenix felt the familiar knot of anxiety that came from watching others fly missions she should have been leading. Her grounding had been based on questioning orders rather than any deficiency in her flying skills or tactical knowledge, but the result was the same. She was standing on the ground while less experienced pilots took aircraft into terrain where her expertise could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophe. Lieutenant Colonel Kim appeared at her side, watching the helicopters fade into distant specks against the mountains that formed the backdrop to their operational area. "Those are good pilots," Kim said quietly, "but they don't know that terrain like you do. I've seen your analysis of the wind patterns and thermal currents in those valleys. There are things that could affect aircraft performance that aren't in any official weather report." Phoenix nodded grimly, thinking about the seasonal atmospheric conditions that could turn routine flight operations into emergency situations without warning. The mountains of Helmand Province created unique weather patterns that could generate sudden downdrafts, unexpected turbulence, and visibility changes that weren't predictable using standard meteorological models. She'd studied historical weather data going back 15 years, correlating atmospheric conditions with aircraft performance reports to identify patterns that could affect mission success. The analysis had revealed seasonal phenomena that occurred with predictable regularity, but weren't documented in any official aviation weather service publications. "There's a thermal inversion layer that forms in those valleys around 0900 hours, Phoenix said, consulting her watch and calculating the timeline for the SEAL insertion. "It creates downdrafts that can reduce helicopter performance by 15% and generates visibility conditions that aren't forecast by standard weather services." Kim looked at her with the expression of someone who recognized expertise when she heard it, regardless of the administrative status of the person providing the information. "Did you include that in your tactical assessment?" "Page 47 through 53, Phoenix replied automatically, "along with recommended altitude adjustments and alternative approach vectors that avoid the worst effects of the thermal activity." But that report was classified as theoretical analysis rather than practical guidance. The radio in the operations center crackled with the first transmission from the departing aircraft. Routine communication that confirmed their departure and estimated time of arrival at the insertion point. Phoenix listened to the professional exchanges between pilots and controllers, hearing the confidence in voices that suggested everything was proceeding according to plan. But she could already visualize the challenges that awaited the formation as they approached the target area. The planned route would take them through a valley system where thermal activity was particularly intense during morning hours. Atmospheric conditions that could affect aircraft handling, characteristics in ways that might surprise pilots who hadn't experienced them before. More importantly, the standard approach corridor was overlooked by several elevated positions where enemy forces could position surface-to-air missiles with clear fields of fire against aircraft following predictable flight paths. Phoenix had identified alternative routes that would approach the insertion point from unexpected directions, but those options required detailed knowledge of terrain features that didn't appear on standard aviation charts. The morning sun climbed higher, increasing the thermal activity that would soon begin affecting aircraft performance in the target area. Phoenix checked her watch again and calculated that the helicopter formation would reach the critical phase of their mission in approximately 30 minutes, entering airspace where her archived analysis could mean the difference between successful insertion and catastrophic failure. She thought about the SEAL teams who were depending on those aircraft for insertion, extraction, and close air support during their high-value target mission. Professional warriors who deserved the best possible aviation support, but who were instead receiving standard procedures that didn't account for the unique challenges of their operational environment. Phoenix had never met the SEAL teams personally, but she'd studied their mission requirements extensively during her preparation of the tactical assessment that nobody had bothered to implement. She knew they would be operating in terrain that limited their mobility and escape options, making them completely dependent on helicopter support for survival if their mission encountered unexpected resistance. The responsibility of that dependence weighed heavily on her as she stood watching the empty flight line, knowing that her expertise was sitting unused in archive files while less experienced pilots navigated challenges they might not fully understand. The grounding that was supposed to teach her respect for authority had instead demonstrated the institutional blindness that could cost lives when bureaucratic considerations took precedence over tactical reality. A new transmission crackled over the radio, the first indication that the mission was encountering unexpected challenges. "Base operations, this is Viper Lead," came Captain Sullivan's voice. Professional, but with an undertone of concern that Phoenix recognized immediately. "We're experiencing unusual atmospheric conditions that weren't in the weather briefing. Requesting updated meteorological information for the target area." Phoenix felt her stomach drop as she heard confirmation of the thermal activity she'd predicted months earlier. The atmospheric phenomena that she'd documented in detail was now affecting aircraft performance exactly as her analysis had indicated. But the information that could help the pilots navigate the conditions safely was buried in files that the operational command had never bothered to review. "Viper Lead, base operations," came the response from the air traffic controller. "Current weather reports show favorable conditions for your operational area. No significant meteorological factors reported by regional weather services." The response was technically accurate, but practically useless, based on weather services that didn't account for the localized atmospheric phenomena that Phoenix had identified through her detailed study of historical data and terrain analysis. The regional weather reports were generated using standardized models that didn't capture the unique conditions created by the specific mountain geography where the SEAL insertion was taking place. Phoenix looked toward the operations center where Colonel Warren and his staff were monitoring the mission progress, confident that their standard procedures would handle any challenges that developed. They were competent officers following established protocols, But their conventional approach was about to encounter unconventional conditions that required unconventional solutions. Base operations, Viper Lead, Sullivan's voice returned, now clearly strained by the effort required to maintain aircraft control in unexpected atmospheric conditions. We're encountering severe downdrafts and visibility reduction that's significantly affecting our approach to the insertion point. These conditions weren't forecast in any of our briefing materials. The thermal inversion layer that Phoenix had documented was now creating exactly the flight hazard she'd predicted: atmospheric disturbances that could turn routine flight operations into emergency situations requiring immediate tactical adjustments. The analysis that could guide the pilots through these conditions safely was sitting in archived files, theoretical work that was proving to have very practical applications. Phoenix made a decision that would change everything. She walked quickly toward the operations center, her administrative folder forgotten as she focused on the immediate need to provide information that could save lives and mission success. The grounding that had kept her away from operational flying was about to be challenged by circumstances that demanded expertise over bureaucratic protocol. The operations center was filled with the controlled tension of personnel monitoring. A complex mission in progress. Radio operators maintained contact with the aircraft formation, while intelligence specialists tracked the progress of the SEAL teams, who were depending on successful helicopter insertion for their high-value target. Mission. Colonel Warren stood at the center of the activity, his attention focused on the tactical display that showed the planned flight routes and current aircraft positions. He was a competent commander following established procedures, but Phoenix could see that neither he nor his staff understood the implications of the atmospheric conditions that were complicating the mission. "Colonel Warren," Phoenix said, approaching the command position with the confidence of someone who had critical information to share. "I have detailed analysis of the atmospheric conditions that are affecting the aircraft. There are alternative approach routes that can minimize the impact of the thermal activity." Warren turned toward her with an expression that mixed annoyance with surprise, clearly not expecting to be approached by a grounded pilot during active mission operations. "Captain Rodriguez, you're not authorized to be in the operations center during active missions. Return to your assigned administrative duties immediately." "Sir, with respect," Phoenix replied, maintaining her professional composure despite the urgency of the situation. "I have specific knowledge of the atmospheric phenomena that are affecting aircraft performance. The thermal inversion patterns I documented can be navigated safely using alternative approach vectors. Your theoretical analysis is not relevant to current operational requirements," Warren snapped, his attention returning to the tactical display. "The pilots are trained to handle atmospheric conditions. Let them do their jobs without interference from personnel who aren't qualified for operational consultation." Phoenix felt the familiar frustration of being dismissed by authority figures who couldn't see past their institutional biases. But the radio transmission that followed changed everything. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Viper 3, came an urgent voice over the emergency frequency. "We've lost engine power due to severe downdraft conditions. Attempting emergency landing in hostile territory." The operations center erupted into controlled chaos as personnel scrambled to coordinate rescue operations for a downed aircraft in enemy-controlled territory. Phoenix watched Colonel Warren's confident expression dissolve as he realized that standard weather briefings had failed to predict conditions that were now threatening the entire mission. "Viper 3 is down hard in Sector 7, reported the radio operator. "Pilot and gunner are alive but injured. Aircraft is a total loss. Enemy forces are likely to respond to the crash site within minutes." Phoenix looked at the tactical display and immediately recognized the crash location as one of the areas where her alternative route analysis could have provided safer passage. The downed helicopter was now in a position where conventional rescue approaches would face the same atmospheric challenges that had caused the original emergency. "Sir," she said to Colonel Warren, her voice steady despite the chaos developing. "Around them, I know how to get aircraft safely through those atmospheric conditions. My analysis includes specific altitude and approach recommendations that can minimize the thermal effects." Warren looked at her with the expression of a man whose conventional solutions had just failed catastrophically. For the first time since her grounding, Phoenix saw uncertainty in his eyes rather than dismissive confidence. The theoretical analysis he'd rejected was suddenly looking very practical as rescue operations began for a crew that was down in hostile territory. The mission that had started as a routine SEAL insertion was becoming a complex rescue operation that would test every aspect of the base's aviation capabilities. Phoenix knew that her archived tactical analysis contained the information needed to navigate the atmospheric challenges safely, but whether the command structure would finally listen to her expertise remained to be seen. The sound of additional helicopters spinning up for emergency rescue operations filled the air. Aircraft that would soon face the same atmospheric conditions that had downed Viper 3. Phoenix realized that the next few hours would determine whether her months of theoretical work would finally be recognized as practical necessity, or whether institutional blindness would continue to cost lives in terrain that only she fully understood. The emergency klaxon wailed across Naval Air Station Oceana as Phoenix sprinted toward the operations center, her administrative folder abandoned on the concrete where it had fallen when the first Mayday call crackled through the radio. Inside the command post, organized chaos reigned as personnel scrambled to coordinate rescue operations for Viper 3 while simultaneously managing the SEAL insertion that was rapidly becoming a secondary priority to saving lives. Colonel Warren stood rigid at the tactical display, his face pale as he processed the reality that his carefully planned mission was disintegrating in real time. The standard atmospheric briefings had failed to predict conditions that were now threatening multiple aircraft, and the rescue operations he was attempting to coordinate faced the same environmental challenges that had downed the first helicopter. "Viper Lead, this is base operations," the radio operator called into his headset. "Viper 3 is down in hostile territory. You are ordered to abort the SEAL insertion and provide close air support for rescue operations." Captain Sullivan's response came through layers of static generated by the atmospheric interference that Phoenix had documented months earlier. "Base operations, Viper Lead. We're still experiencing severe turbulence and visibility reduction. Our targeting systems are compromised by the atmospheric conditions. We can provide limited support, but precision engagement is not possible in current environmental situation." Phoenix moved closer to the tactical display, studying the crash site location and the planned rescue approaches that were being hastily coordinated by officers who had never flown in the specific terrain where Viper 3 had gone down. Conventional rescue procedures called for a direct approach using maximum speed to minimize exposure time. But Phoenix could see immediately that such an approach would encounter the worst effects of the thermal inversion layer. "Colonel Warren," she said, approaching the command position with the urgency of someone who had critical information that could save lives. "The thermal conditions that downed Viper 3 are predictable and avoidable. I have specific route recommendations that can get rescue aircraft to the crash site safely." Warren turned toward her with an expression that showed he was finally beginning to understand that conventional solutions might not be adequate for the current crisis. "What kind of route recommendations?" he asked, his voice tight with the stress of managing multiple simultaneous emergencies. Phoenix moved to the digital map display and began tracing alternative approach vectors that she'd identified during her comprehensive terrain analysis. The thermal inversion creates downdrafts along the primary ridgelines, but there are secondary valleys that remain stable due to different solar heating patterns. Aircraft can approach the crash site using these corridors with minimal atmospheric interference. "How do you know this?" demanded Major Patricia Hayes, the operations officer who had been coordinating rescue efforts using standard procedures. These atmospheric conditions weren't predicted by any official weather service. Because I've been studying this specific terrain for 8 months, Phoenix replied, her finger continuing to trace safe passage routes on the tactical display. The thermal inversion patterns are seasonal and predictable, but they occur at a localized level that regional weather services don't monitor. I documented the phenomenon in detail, including specific altitude and timing recommendations. Colonel, Warren stared at the alternative routes Phoenix was indicating, routes that deviated significantly from standard flight corridors, but offered passage through areas where the atmospheric disturbances would be minimal. For the first time since her grounding, he was looking at her expertise rather than her disciplinary record. The radio crackled with another emergency transmission that made everyone in the operations center freeze. "Any station, this is Viper. 3 crew on the ground," came a weak voice through heavy static. "We have enemy movement converging on our position from multiple directions. Pilot has internal injuries. Gunner has a broken leg. We need immediate extraction, or we're going to be overrun." Phoenix felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders as she realized that the crew of Viper 3 was depending on rescue aircraft that would have to navigate the same atmospheric conditions that had caused the original crash. The standard rescue procedures would likely result in additional aircraft losses, while her alternative approach routes could provide safe passage to the crash site. "Colonel," she said, meeting Warren's eyes with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done, "I can guide rescue aircraft through the atmospheric conditions safely, but only if you're willing to authorize non-standard approach procedures." Warren looked at the tactical display, then at the radio operator who was coordinating increasingly desperate communications with the downed crew, then back at Phoenix. "What would you need?" "Direct radio communication with the rescue aircraft, and authorization to provide real-time navigation guidance using the alternative routes I've mapped," Phoenix replied. "The atmospheric conditions are dynamic, but predictable if you understand the thermal patterns. I can get them through safely." Major Hayes stepped forward with obvious skepticism. "Colonel, Captain Rodriguez hasn't flown combat missions in 8 months. She's not current on operational procedures or qualified to provide tactical guidance to rescue operations. She's also the only person who predicted the atmospheric conditions that just downed one of our aircraft," Warren replied. Sharply, "Right now I'm more interested in her expertise than her disciplinary status." The decision that followed would be debated for years in military aviation circles, but at that moment it seemed like the only rational choice available. Colonel Warren authorized Phoenix to provide direct navigation guidance to rescue aircraft, effectively putting a grounded pilot in charge of operations that conventional procedures had failed to handle successfully. Phoenix moved to the radio console and adjusted the frequency to communicate directly with Viper 4, the aircraft that had been designated as the primary rescue platform. "Viper 4, this is Phoenix Control. I have alternative approach vectors that will minimize atmospheric interference. Are you ready to copy navigation guidance?" "Phoenix Control, Viper 4, came the immediate response from Captain Lisa Chun, a pilot Phoenix recognized as competent, but inexperienced in mountain flying. "We're ready for any guidance you can provide. These atmospheric conditions are unlike anything in our training scenarios." Phoenix consulted the detailed terrain maps she'd memorized during months of theoretical analysis and began providing precise navigation instructions that would guide the rescue aircraft through corridors where thermal activity was minimal. "Viper 4, adjust heading to 270 degrees and descend to altitude 4,000 feet. You'll encounter a ridgeline that provides natural wind shadow from the thermal currents." The rescue helicopter adjusted course according to Phoenix's instructions, deviating from the direct approach that conventional procedures would have dictated. Instead of fighting through the worst atmospheric disturbances, Viper 4 began following a route that used terrain features to minimize exposure to the downdrafts and turbulence that had downed the first aircraft. Phoenix Control, Viper 4. Chun's voice came back with obvious relief. Atmospheric conditions are much more stable on this approach vector. How did you know these corridors would be clear? Solar heating patterns create predictable thermal activity based on terrain orientation and elevation. Phoenix explained while continuing to monitor the rescue aircraft's progress on the tactical display. The primary ridgelines face east and generate strong thermal currents during morning hours, but the secondary valleys remain stable due to different solar exposure. Colonel Warren stood behind Phoenix, listening to her provide navigation guidance with the precision of someone who understood atmospheric dynamics at a level that went far beyond standard pilot training. The alternative routes she was directing were not random deviations from conventional procedures, but carefully calculated paths that took advantage of natural phenomena that most pilots never learned to recognize. Viper 4 is approaching the crash site, reported the radio operator monitoring multiple frequencies simultaneously. They're maintaining stable flight conditions using the alternative approach vector. Phoenix continued providing real-time guidance as the rescue helicopter navigated through terrain that would have been hazardous using conventional approaches. Her months of studying atmospheric patterns and thermal dynamics were finally being put to practical use, theoretical knowledge that was proving to have very immediate applications for saving lives. Phoenix Control, Viper 4, Chun transmitted as the rescue aircraft reached the crash site. We have visual contact with Viper 3 crew. Atmospheric conditions are stable enough for hover operations. Beginning casualty extraction now. The successful approach was only the first phase of a rescue operation that would require the helicopter to lift off with wounded personnel and navigate back through the same atmospheric challenges. Phoenix knew that the thermal conditions would continue to evolve as the morning sun climbed higher, requiring constant adjustments to maintain safe passage through the mountain terrain. While Viper 4 conducted the actual rescue, Phoenix maintained radio contact with Viper Lead and the remaining aircraft in the formation, providing atmospheric briefings that allowed them to adjust their operations according to the dynamic conditions. For the first time in 8 months, her expertise was being utilized for its intended purpose, rather than being dismissed as theoretical irrelevance. Viper 4 has successfully extracted both crew members, reported the radio operator as the rescue operation reached its critical phase. Pilot is stable but requires immediate medical attention. Gunner is conscious and alert. They're beginning return flight to base. Phoenix guided the loaded rescue helicopter through the return journey, adjusting the route recommendations as thermal activity intensified with the rising sun. The alternative corridors she'd identified provided safe passage, but they required precise navigation and constant monitoring of atmospheric conditions that could change rapidly in mountain terrain. Phoenix Control, this is Viper 4. Chun transmitted as the rescue aircraft cleared the most challenging portion of the return flight. I don't know how you identified these route corridors, but they made the difference between mission success and potential disaster. The atmospheric conditions along the standard approaches would have been impossible to navigate safely. The successful rescue of Viper 3's crew was transmitted throughout the base's communication system, but Phoenix knew that the larger mission was still in jeopardy. The SEAL teams were still waiting for insertion, and the atmospheric conditions that had complicated the rescue operation would continue to affect any aircraft operating in the target area. Colonel Warren approached Phoenix's position at the radio console, his expression showing a mixture of gratitude and professional curiosity. Captain Rodriguez, your navigation guidance just saved 2 lives and prevented what could have been a second aircraft loss. I need to understand how you develop this level of expertise in atmospheric conditions that our standard weather services failed to predict. Phoenix looked up from the radio equipment where she'd been coordinating with multiple aircraft, feeling for the first time in months that her knowledge was being valued rather than dismissed. I've been studying the specific terrain and atmospheric patterns for this operational area since my grounding began 8 months ago. The thermal inversion phenomena occur seasonally and can be predicted using detailed analysis of topographical features and solar heating patterns. Why wasn't this information included in standard weather briefings? Warren asked, though his tone suggested he was beginning to understand the institutional failures that had led to the current crisis. Because I was told that atmospheric analysis was handled by meteorological specialists with proper credentials, Phoenix replied. My terrain and weather reports were filed as theoretical work rather than practical guidance for operational use. The radio interrupted their conversation with another transmission from the operational area. Base operations, this is Viper. Lead, Sullivan's voice carried tension that suggested new complications were developing. We've been observing enemy movement toward the planned SEAL insertion point. Multiple vehicles and personnel are converging on the target area. The insertion mission may be compromised. Phoenix studied the tactical display, showing the planned insertion site, and immediately recognized the tactical problems that were developing. The SEAL teams needed to be inserted according to their mission timeline, but the standard approach. Routes would expose aircraft to both atmospheric hazards and enemy fire from positions that could observe conventional flight corridors. Colonel Warren, she said, tracing alternative routes on the tactical display. I can guide the aircraft to the insertion point using approaches that avoid both the atmospheric disturbances and the enemy observation positions, but it will require precise navigation and coordination between multiple aircraft. Warren looked at the tactical situation developing on his display screens, weighing the risks of authorizing continued deviation from standard procedures against the potential for mission failure if conventional approaches were attempted. Successful rescue of Viper 3 had demonstrated the value of Phoenix's unconventional expertise, but inserting SEAL teams into hostile territory would require an even higher level of precision and tactical coordination. What would be required for alternative insertion approaches? Warren asked, his question indicating that he was seriously considering authorizing Phoenix to guide the most critical phase of the entire operation. Phoenix pointed to routes on the tactical display that would approach the insertion point from unexpected directions, using terrain masking to conceal aircraft movement from enemy observation while avoiding the atmospheric disturbances that had been causing flight hazards. The SEAL teams can be inserted using these approach corridors, but the aircraft will need to follow precise timing and altitude recommendations to maintain both safety and tactical surprise. Major Hayes stepped forward again, her expression showing continued skepticism about authorizing a grounded pilot to direct combat operations. Colonel, this is highly irregular. Captain Rodriguez hasn't been cleared for operational missions, and we're talking about directing aircraft into hostile territory during active combat operations. Major Hayes, Warren replied with the authority of someone who had seen conventional procedures fail when unconventional challenges required unconventional solutions. Captain Rodriguez has guided a successful rescue through atmospheric conditions that our standard weather services failed to predict. Right now, her expertise appears to be more valuable than our standard procedures. The decision to authorize Phoenix's continued involvement in mission represented a fundamental shift in how the command structure evaluated expertise versus institutional authority. For 8 months, her knowledge had been dismissed because it didn't fit established patterns of who was qualified to provide tactical guidance. The crisis that was now unfolding had forced a recognition that expertise could exist outside conventional channels. Phoenix moved back to the radio console and began coordinating with Viper Lead for the modified SEAL insertion that would use her alternative approach routes. Viper Lead, this is Phoenix Control. I have navigation guidance for SEAL. Insertion using approach vectors that will minimize both atmospheric interference and enemy observation. Are you ready to copy detailed routing instructions? Phoenix Control, Viper Lead, Sullivan responded immediately. We're ready for any guidance that can get us through these conditions safely. The standard approaches are not viable given current atmospheric and tactical situation. Phoenix began providing detailed navigation instructions that would guide the aircraft formation through a complex series of approach corridors, each designed to take advantage of terrain features that would mask aircraft movement while avoiding the atmospheric disturbances that had been causing flight hazards. The insertion would require precise timing and coordination, but it offered the best chance for mission success given the challenging conditions. Viper formation. Adjust heading to 315 degrees and maintain altitude 6,000 feet. Phoenix transmitted, watching the aircraft positions on the tactical display. You'll be following a ridgeline that provides natural concealment from enemy observation positions while avoiding the primary thermal corridors. The aircraft formation adjusted course according to Phoenix's instructions, beginning a complex navigation sequence that would take them through terrain features that most pilots would never consider using for tactical approach routes. The alternative corridors required detailed knowledge of how topographical features affected both atmospheric conditions and tactical visibility, information that existed only in the comprehensive analysis Phoenix had compiled during her months of grounded status. As the aircraft moved through the first phase of the alternative approach, Phoenix continued monitoring atmospheric conditions and adjusting route recommendations in real time. The thermal patterns were evolving as she had predicted, but her understanding of the dynamic conditions allowed her to guide the aircraft through corridors that remained stable despite the changing atmospheric environment. Phoenix Control, Viper Lead, Sullivan transmitted as the formation navigated through increasingly challenging terrain. Atmospheric conditions are stable on this approach vector, and we have no indication of enemy observation. How much longer? Until we reach the insertion point? Phoenix consulted her detailed terrain maps and calculated the remaining distance and timing for the modified insertion approach. Viper Lead, you are 12 minutes from the insertion point. Continue current heading and prepare for altitude adjustment to 4,000 feet in approximately 6 minutes. The SEAL insertion was proceeding according to Phoenix's alternative plan, but she knew that the most critical phase was still ahead. The actual insertion would require the aircraft to hover in hostile territory while the SEAL teams rappelled to the ground, a vulnerable period when enemy forces could engage aircraft that couldn't maneuver defensively. All aircraft, this is Phoenix Control, she transmitted to the entire formation. Beginning final approach phase to insertion point. Maintain radio discipline and execute insertion procedures according to modified timeline on transmitting now. The success of the alternative insertion approach would determine whether Phoenix's expertise would finally be recognized as valuable, or whether the institutional biases that had kept her grounded would reassert themselves once the immediate crisis had passed. The next 12 minutes would test everything she had learned about atmospheric conditions, tactical navigation, and the terrain that she understood better than anyone else involved in the operation. Colonel Warren stood behind her position, monitoring the progress of aircraft that were now completely dependent on navigation guidance from a pilot who had been considered unsuitable for operational duties just hours earlier. The irony was not lost on either of them that the expertise the command structure had dismissed was now the key to mission success in conditions that conventional procedures could not handle effectively. The radio crackled with a transmission that indicated the mission was entering its most dangerous phase. Phoenix Control, Viper Lead, we have visual contact with the insertion point. Enemy activity appears minimal in our immediate area. Ready to begin SEAL deployment on your command. Phoenix took a deep breath and prepared to guide the final phase of an operation that would either vindicate her months of theoretical analysis or demonstrate the limits of unconventional expertise when applied to real-world combat situations. The SEAL teams were depending on her ability to get aircraft safely into and out of hostile territory, and the success or failure of the entire mission now rested on knowledge that had been sitting unused in archive files for 8 months. Viper Lead, Phoenix Control. She transmitted with the confidence of someone who understood exactly what needed to be done. You are cleared for SEAL insertion. Execute according to modified procedures and be prepared for immediate extraction on my command. The SEAL insertion unfolded with mechanical precision as Phoenix guided each aircraft through the complex hover sequences required to deploy teams into hostile territory. Through the radio static, she could hear the rapid-fire communications between pilots and ground forces as operators fast-roped into positions that would allow them to accomplish their high-value target mission. Phoenix Control, Viper 2, came the transmission from Captain Maria Santos, whose aircraft was providing overwatch during the insertion. SEAL Team Alpha is on the ground and moving toward their objective. No enemy contact reported during deployment. Phoenix monitored the tactical display showing aircraft positions and ground team movements, calculating the timing for extraction operations that would be even more challenging than the insertion had been. The SEAL teams would need immediate pickup once their mission was complete, and enemy forces would likely be alerted to coalition presence by the time extraction became necessary. Viper Formation, this is Phoenix Control, she transmitted to all aircraft simultaneously. Begin establishing extraction positions according to alternative route plan Charlie. Enemy response time to insertion area is estimated at 23 minutes based on observed vehicle movement patterns. The aircraft formation dispersed according to Phoenix's coordination, taking positions that would allow rapid response for emergency extraction while maintaining concealment from enemy observation. The alternative positions she had identified provided tactical advantages that conventional extraction planning had not considered, using terrain features that masked aircraft signatures while maintaining rapid access to the ground teams. Colonel Warren observed the coordinated aircraft movement from his position at the tactical display, watching as helicopters maneuvered through terrain using navigation guidance that deviated significantly from standard military procedures. Captain Rodriguez, he said quietly, how did you identify these positioning areas? They're not marked on any tactical aviation charts. Seasonal water flow patterns and historical geology surveys, Phoenix replied while continuing to monitor multiple radio frequencies. These depressions provide natural concealment during certain times of year, and the terrain acoustics minimize rotor noise signatures that enemy forces use to locate aircraft positions. The complexity of Phoenix's terrain analysis was becoming apparent to everyone in the operations center as they watched aircraft operate in areas that conventional planning had never considered viable for helicopter operations. Her understanding of environmental factors went far beyond standard pilot training, incorporating geological and seasonal knowledge that transformed seemingly unusable terrain into tactical advantages. Phoenix Control, this is SEAL Team Alpha. Leader, came a new voice over the tactical frequency. We have eyes on the target compound. Multiple hostile personnel observed, but we maintain concealment. Request confirmation of extraction timeline and procedures. Phoenix consulted her detailed mission timeline and atmospheric projections, calculating how long the SEAL teams could remain in position before enemy forces would likely detect their presence. SEAL Team Alpha, Phoenix Control. You have 37 minutes before atmospheric conditions will compromise extraction safety. Alternative extraction point Bravo is available if primary location becomes compromised. The precision of Phoenix's timing recommendations reflected months of studying how atmospheric conditions affected helicopter performance during different phases of daily thermal cycles. The extraction window she had calculated balanced mission Requirements against environmental factors that could turn routine pickup operations into emergency situations requiring immediate tactical adjustments. Base operations, this is Viper Lead. Sullivan transmitted with growing confidence in the unconventional guidance he was receiving. All aircraft are positioned for extraction operations. The alternative positioning areas provide excellent concealment and tactical flexibility. How did standard planning miss these advantages? Colonel Warren exchanged glances with Major Hayes, both recognizing that Phoenix's expertise was revealing significant gaps in conventional tactical planning procedures. The alternative approaches she had developed during her grounded status were demonstrating capabilities that established military doctrine had never acknowledged or incorporated into operational planning. The radio crackled with the first indication that the SEAL mission was encountering complications. Phoenix Control, SEAL Team Alpha Leader, came an urgent transmission. Target is not at the primary compound. Intelligence indicates he departed the area approximately 2 hours ago. We're moving to secondary objective location. Phoenix immediately began calculating new extraction requirements based on the changed mission timeline and different geographical location. The secondary objective was located in terrain that presented different atmospheric challenges and required modified approach procedures for safe helicopter operations. SEAL Team Alpha, Phoenix Control, she transmitted while studying topographical features around the new objective area. Secondary location extraction will require modified procedures due to different terrain characteristics. Recommend you complete mission objectives within 45 minutes to maintain optimal atmospheric conditions for pickup. The tactical situation was becoming more complex as the SEAL teams moved through terrain that had not been included in original mission planning, but Phoenix's comprehensive analysis of the entire operational area allowed her to provide navigation guidance for locations that had never been considered for helicopter operations. Viper formation, this is Phoenix Control, she continued, coordinating aircraft repositioning to support the modified mission requirements. Adjust positioning to support secondary extraction location. New coordinates and approach vectors are being transmitted now. The aircraft formation moved according to Phoenix's updated guidance, demonstrating the flexibility that unconventional tactical planning could provide when circumstances required immediate adaptation to changing mission requirements. The alternative positioning areas and approach routes she had mapped allowed rapid response to developments that would have complicated conventional extraction procedures. Colonel Warren watched the coordinated response to mission changes with growing appreciation for the systematic approach Phoenix had taken to understanding their operational environment. Captain Rodriguez, how comprehensive is your analysis of this operational area? How much terrain have you mapped using these alternative procedures? Approximately 800 square miles of detailed terrain analysis, Phoenix replied without taking her attention away from the radio communications she was coordinating. Every significant geographical feature that could affect helicopter operations, including seasonal variations and atmospheric patterns that occur throughout the year. The scope of Phoenix's self-directed analysis was becoming clear to the command staff as they realized she had essentially created an alternative tactical planning system during the months when her expertise had been dismissed as irrelevant to operational requirements. Her grounded status had provided the time and motivation to develop knowledge that was now proving essential for mission success. Phoenix Control, SEAL Team Alpha Leader, came another transmission indicating that the ground mission was progressing toward completion. Secondary objective secured. High-value target in custody, ready for extraction in 15 minutes. Requesting confirmation of pickup procedures and timing. Phoenix felt a surge of satisfaction as she realized that the SEAL mission was approaching successful completion, despite the complications that had required immediate tactical adjustments. Her alternative extraction procedures would now be tested under the most challenging conditions possible. with ground teams depending on precise coordination for safe extraction from hostile territory. SEAL Team Alpha, Phoenix Control, she transmitted with the confidence of someone who had anticipated every aspect of the extraction requirements. Extraction procedures confirmed. Primary pickup location remains viable using modified approach vector delta. Estimated time to extraction is 16 minutes. The extraction phase would require aircraft to operate in hostile territory during daylight hours while carrying additional personnel who could not defend themselves during flight operations. Phoenix knew that her alternative approach routes would be crucial for avoiding enemy observation while navigating the atmospheric conditions that continued to evolve throughout the morning. Viper lead. This is Phoenix Control, she continued, coordinating the most critical phase of the entire operation. Begin extraction approach using vector delta procedures. Maintain altitude 4,200 feet until final approach phase, then descend according to terrain masking sequence I provided in your navigation package. The extraction helicopters began their approach to the pickup location using routes that Phoenix had calculated to minimize both atmospheric interference and enemy observation opportunities. The success of the alternative navigation procedures during insertion had demonstrated their tactical value, but extraction operations presented additional challenges that would test every aspect of her terrain analysis. Phoenix Control Viper lead. Sullivan transmitted as the extraction aircraft navigated through increasingly complex terrain features. Atmospheric conditions remain stable on this approach vector. We have no indication of enemy observation or anti-aircraft activity. Approaching extraction point now. Phoenix monitored the tactical display, showing aircraft positions converging on the location where SEAL teams were waiting for pickup, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether her months of theoretical analysis had successfully addressed every aspect of helicopter operations in challenging environmental conditions. SEAL Team Alpha, Viper lead, came the coordination transmission between aircraft and ground forces. We have visual contact with your position. Beginning final approach for extraction. Prepare for immediate loading. The extraction proceeded with the same precision that had characterized the entire mission, with aircraft following approach procedures that avoided atmospheric disturbances while maintaining tactical surprise against enemy forces that might be responding to coalition presence in their operational area. Phoenix Control, Viper lead, Sullivan reported as the extraction reached its completion phase. SEAL teams and high-value target are aboard, beginning return flight to base. All objectives accomplished successfully. Phoenix guided the loaded aircraft through return routes that would ensure safe passage while carrying personnel who had completed one of the most challenging missions of the deployment. The alternative corridors she had mapped provided concealment and atmospheric stability during the vulnerable phase when heavily loaded aircraft were least capable of defensive maneuvering. Viper formation. This is Phoenix Control, she transmitted to the entire flight as they began the journey back to base. Maintain current routing and altitude recommendations. Atmospheric conditions will continue to evolve. The projected flight path will avoid areas of significant thermal activity. The successful completion of the SEAL mission using alternative navigation procedures that Phoenix had developed during her grounded status represented a fundamental validation of expertise that had been dismissed by conventional institutional thinking. The high-value target capture that had been accomplished would not have been possible using standard approaches that failed to account for environmental factors Phoenix had identified. Colonel Warren approached Phoenix's position at the radio console as communication traffic decreased with the aircraft formation safely en route to base. Captain Rodriguez, what you accomplished today goes far beyond successful mission completion. You've demonstrated tactical capabilities that our standard procedures don't even acknowledge. Phoenix looked up from the radio equipment where she had been coordinating multiple aircraft through terrain that conventional planning had considered unsuitable for helicopter operations. The capabilities were always there, Colonel. The information was documented and available for months. It just wasn't considered relevant to operational requirements. Why wasn't your analysis integrated into standard mission planning procedures? Warren asked, though his tone suggested he was beginning to understand the institutional failures that had prevented utilization of valuable expertise. Because the analysis came from someone who had been grounded for questioning conventional procedures, Phoenix replied diplomatically. The command structure preferred to rely on established methods rather than unconventional expertise from unofficial sources. The radio interrupted their conversation with a transmission indicating that the mission aircraft were approaching. Base airspace. Base operations, this is Viper Lead. Formation of 4 aircraft requesting landing clearance. Mission accomplished successfully. All personnel and objectives secured. Phoenix coordinated the landing sequence for aircraft returning from operations that had tested every aspect of her alternative tactical planning system. The successful mission completion had demonstrated that unconventional expertise could achieve results that standard procedures had been unable to accomplish under challenging environmental conditions. Viper formation cleared for landing, she transmitted, providing final navigation guidance for aircraft approaching their home base. Outstanding work by all crews. Mission success confirms effectiveness of alternative navigation procedures under operational conditions. As the helicopters settled onto their landing pads, Phoenix realized that her 8 months of grounded status had finally ended not through administrative review or disciplinary reconsideration, but through practical demonstration that her expertise was essential for mission success in conditions that conventional procedures could not handle effectively. Colonel Warren stood beside her as they watched the aircraft shut down and ground crews begin post-mission procedures. Captain Rodriguez, I'm recommending immediate reinstatement of your flight status and assignment as Senior Tactical Planning Officer for this operational area. Your analysis capabilities are too valuable to waste on administrative duties. The recommendation represented more than personal vindication for Phoenix. It acknowledged that expertise could exist outside established institutional channels, and that unconventional thinking could provide solutions when conventional approaches proved inadequate for complex challenges. Thank you, Colonel, Phoenix replied, feeling for the first time in months that her knowledge was being valued for its intended purpose rather than being dismissed as irrelevant theory. I'd like to expand the alternative navigation analysis to cover our entire operational region and develop training programs that incorporate environmental factors into standard pilot education. Warren nodded approvingly, recognizing that Phoenix's expertise could benefit far more missions than the single operation that had demonstrated its value. Approved. I want comprehensive analysis of alternative tactical procedures for this entire theater of operations. Your methods just saved lives and accomplished objectives that conventional planning couldn't achieve. The sound of celebration echoed across the base as news of the successful high-value target mission spread through the personnel who had been monitoring the operation. Phoenix felt deep satisfaction knowing that her theoretical work had contributed to practical results that would impact broader military operations throughout the region. Major Hayes approached Phoenix's position with an expression that mixed professional respect with personal acknowledgement of having misjudged the value of unconventional expertise. Captain Rodriguez, I owe you an apology. Your analysis capabilities proved essential for mission success that conventional procedures couldn't achieve. No apology necessary, Major, Phoenix replied graciously. The important thing is that the mission succeeded and everyone came home safely. Institutional skepticism serves important purposes, but this situation required unconventional solutions. The diplomatic response reflected Phoenix's understanding that institutional resistance to unconventional approaches served legitimate purposes in most circumstances, but that flexibility was required when standard procedures proved inadequate. For unique challenges, 2 weeks later, Captain Jessica Rodriguez stood in the main briefing room at Naval Air Station Oceana. But this time she was at the front of the room, facing an audience of senior officers and Pentagon aviation specialists who had flown in specifically to hear her detailed explanation of the tactical innovations that had revolutionized helicopter operations in challenging environmental conditions. Brigadier General Patricia Coleman sat at the center of the review panel, her expression showing the intense interest reserved for breakthrough developments that challenged fundamental assumptions about military aviation capabilities. Behind her, projection screens displayed Phoenix's atmospheric analysis data and alternative navigation procedures, the same information that had been dismissed as theoretical work just weeks earlier. Captain Rodriguez, General Coleman began, consulting her notes. Your unauthorized tactical innovations during the September 5th mission have been thoroughly investigated and validated by independent atmospheric specialists. The alternative navigation procedures you developed achieved mission success rates that conventional methods had been unable to accomplish. Phoenix stood at attention, her posture confident despite the formal nature of the proceedings. Yes, ma'am. The atmospheric terrain mapping techniques proved effective under operational conditions that had been preventing successful mission completion using standard navigation procedures. More than effective, interjected Colonel Patricia Morrison, a senior Pentagon aviation analyst whose opinion carried significant weight in tactical development circles. Your procedures succeeded where conventional approaches had failed repeatedly. Multiple missions in similar environmental conditions had been aborted due to atmospheric factors that your analysis successfully predicted and circumvented. The institutional validation that Phoenix was receiving represented a fundamental shift in how military aviation evaluated expertise versus conventional authority. Her grounded status had provided the time and motivation to develop knowledge that was now being recognized as essential for operations in challenging environmental conditions. Dr. Amanda Foster, who had been brought in as an independent expert witness to validate Phoenix's atmospheric analysis, stood to address the panel. I want to emphasize something important about Captain Rodriguez's work that distinguishes it from conventional meteorological analysis, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone with extensive experience in atmospheric research. When standard weather services failed to predict conditions that were affecting flight operations, we assumed the atmospheric phenomena were unpredictable anomalies. Captain Rodriguez demonstrated that these conditions follow systematic patterns that can be analyzed and anticipated using detailed geographical and seasonal data. Phoenix felt vindicated hearing independent confirmation that her analytical methods had scientific validity beyond their practical military applications. The atmospheric phenomena she had studied were not random weather events, but predictable environmental factors that could be incorporated into tactical planning procedures. General Coleman turned her attention back to Phoenix. The investigation has revealed that your atmospheric and terrain analysis had been available to operational planners for 8 months prior to the September 5th mission. Why weren't these procedures integrated into standard mission planning protocols? Phoenix glanced toward the witness section where Colonel Warren sat, recognizing that institutional failures had prevented utilization of analysis that could have benefited multiple missions during the period when her expertise had been dismissed as irrelevant theory. The atmospheric terrain mapping was classified as theoretical research rather than practical guidance for operational use. Phoenix replied diplomatically. The institutional preference was to rely on conventional meteorological services and established navigation procedures. Conventional procedures that resulted in multiple mission failures and aircraft losses, General Coleman stated, her tone indicating displeasure with institutional blindness that had cost lives and compromised mission effectiveness. While your unconventional analysis achieved complete mission success under conditions that had been preventing operational objectives, Colonel Warren stood to address the panel. his expression showing professional accountability for decisions that had failed to recognize available expertise. General Coleman, I take full responsibility for the failure to integrate Captain Rodriguez's analysis into operational planning. Her work was dismissed as excessive theoretical detail rather than being evaluated for practical applications. Colonel Warren, General Coleman replied firmly, your handling of available expertise has been found inadequate by every measure we've applied. The systematic dismissal of innovative analysis represents exactly the kind of institutional rigidity that compromises military effectiveness. Phoenix watched as institutional authority was being held accountable for decisions that had prevented utilization of expertise that could have prevented the complications encountered during multiple missions. The validation she was receiving extended beyond personal vindication to acknowledgement that innovation could emerge from unexpected sources. General Coleman addressed Phoenix directly. The Pentagon has decided to implement atmospheric terrain mapping as standard curriculum in our advanced aviation training programs. You'll be leading the development and instruction of these procedures across all branches of military aviation, effective immediately. The assignment that Phoenix was receiving represented transformation from grounded pilot to institutional authority for revolutionary tactical procedures that would affect military aviation operations worldwide. Her expertise would now be taught to pilots who would carry these techniques into operations where environmental challenges required unconventional solutions. Thank you, General, Phoenix managed to say, her voice steady despite the emotions generated by official recognition of work that had been dismissed for months. I won't disappoint the trust you're placing in this analytical approach. You already haven't disappointed anyone, Colonel Morrison interjected. Your innovations saved lives and accomplished missions that conventional procedures couldn't achieve. The atmospheric terrain mapping you developed represents the most significant advancement in tactical aviation planning we've seen in decades. Through the briefing room windows, Phoenix could see the flight line where aircraft were being prepared for missions using navigation procedures that incorporated her atmospheric analysis. The helicopters that had been limited by conventional planning restrictions were now operating with tactical advantages that her alternative approaches had made possible. Captain Lisa Chun, who had piloted the successful rescue mission using Phoenix's guidance, approached after the formal proceedings concluded. Major Rodriguez, she said, emphasizing Phoenix's new rank with obvious satisfaction. The atmospheric navigation techniques you developed have been incorporated into our standard operating procedures. Every pilot in the squadron is now trained in environmental analysis methods. Phoenix smiled at the transformation from dismissed theoretical researcher to essential tactical educator, thinking about the journey from grounded status to institutional authority for revolutionary procedures that were changing how military aviation approached environmental challenges. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos appeared beside them, representing the ground crews who had witnessed the practical applications of Phoenix's analytical methods. Major Rodriguez, the maintenance teams wanted me to express appreciation for the atmospheric analysis procedures. Understanding environmental factors helps us prepare aircraft for conditions that conventional weather services don't predict. Phoenix looked at the personnel whose operations had been improved by integration of environmental analysis into standard procedures, feeling deep satisfaction that her work was contributing to mission success across multiple levels of military aviation operations. Dr. Foster joined the group, extending her hand with obvious respect for the institutional changes that Phoenix's work had generated. Major Rodriguez, the atmospheric research community has formally recognized your tactical applications of environmental analysis. Your methods are being studied by meteorological specialists worldwide. As the briefing room emptied and officials returned to their assignments, Phoenix remained at the front of the room, looking at projection screens that still displayed her atmospheric terrain data. The analytical methods that had been dismissed as excessive theoretical detail were now being implemented by tactical specialists throughout military aviation. She thought about that morning when she had stood on the flight line holding administrative folders while watching others prepare for missions she wasn't allowed to fly. The memory seemed distant now, like something from a different career where potential was limited by institutional assumptions rather than being measured by actual capability and innovative thinking. Phoenix's unauthorized coordination of mission operations had become legendary within military aviation circles, demonstrating that sometimes the person everyone dismisses is exactly the person who sees solutions that conventional thinking cannot perceive. Her atmospheric terrain mapping techniques would save hundreds of lives in future operations, enabling successful missions in environmental conditions previously considered impossible for helicopter operations. But for Phoenix, the greatest victory was institutional recognition that expertise could exist outside established channels and that innovation often required challenging conventional assumptions about what was possible. Her story would be taught at military academies as proof that sometimes following your professional knowledge was more important than following institutional limitations. She had started that day as Captain Jessica Rodriguez, grounded pilot and dismissed expert whose analysis was considered irrelevant theory. She was ending it as Major Jessica Rodriguez, institutional authority for revolutionary procedures that proved environmental challenges were opportunities for tactical advantage, rather than obstacles to mission success. The impossible had become routine through systematic analysis and practical application of knowledge that conventional thinking had failed to recognize or utilize. Phoenix had demonstrated that atmospheric terrain could be navigated safely and effectively when pilots understood environmental factors that standard training had never acknowledged. 5 years after that mission-changing day, Major Jessica Rodriguez stood on the observation deck of the Pentagon's newest aviation training facility, watching young pilots practice atmospheric terrain mapping in advanced simulation systems that incorporated her analytical methods into standard curriculum taught worldwide. The techniques she had developed during her grounded status were now considered essential knowledge for any pilot operating in challenging environmental conditions, transforming theoretical analysis into practical skills that saved lives and accomplished missions that conventional procedures could not achieve. Through the reinforced windows, she could see rows of sophisticated flight simulators where pilots learned to navigate impossible atmospheric conditions using principles that had been dismissed as irrelevant theory just years earlier. What had once been considered excessive analytical detail was now regarded as fundamental survival training for military aviation. The Rodriguez method has revolutionized tactical aviation planning, reported Colonel Sarah Kim, Phoenix's former colleague who now served as Deputy Director of the Atmospheric Navigation Program. We've documented over 400 successful missions in environmental conditions that would have been impossible using conventional meteorological analysis. Phoenix smiled as she watched a young pilot successfully navigate simulated atmospheric disturbances using terrain mapping principles, threading through invisible environmental hazards that instruments couldn't detect but trained analysis could predict and circumvent. Each successful simulation represented lives that would be saved in actual operations, personnel who would complete missions because someone had been willing to think beyond established limitations. The walls of the facility were lined with mission reports from operations worldwide, hurricane evacuations where atmospheric terrain mapping provided safe passage through storm systems that conventional navigation couldn't handle, earthquake rescue operations in mountainous regions where environmental analysis enabled aircraft access to areas that standard procedures had declared impossible, and combat missions where understanding atmospheric factors provided tactical advantages that determined mission success. "Ma'am," called out Instructor Pilot Chun, the same officer who had piloted rescue operations using Phoenix's guidance years earlier, The new class wants to hear about the original mission that established atmospheric terrain mapping as standard procedure. Phoenix nodded and made her way to the main briefing room where 50 young pilots waited to hear the story that had become foundational legend within military aviation education. These weren't just students, but future tactical innovators who would carry forward principles that environmental challenges were opportunities for tactical advantage rather than limitations on operational capability. The most important lesson I can teach you, Phoenix began, looking out at eager faces representing the future of military aviation, isn't about atmospheric analysis or environmental navigation techniques. It's about having confidence to act on professional knowledge when institutional thinking says something can't be accomplished. She gestured toward mission reports covering the walls, each representing successful operations that had been achieved using principles that conventional planning had never acknowledged. Every one of these mission successes happened because someone refused to accept that environmental limitations were absolute obstacles. Someone analyzed seemingly impossible conditions and developed methods to transform challenges into tactical advantages. The young pilots listened intently as Phoenix described that morning at Naval Air Station Oceana when conventional procedures had failed while alternative analysis had achieved mission success despite environmental conditions that standard planning had considered prohibitive for helicopter operations. Your technical training will teach you how to fly aircraft safely, she concluded, but your analytical training will teach you when and where to fly missions that others consider impossible. Sometimes the most important operations are the ones that require thinking beyond conventional limitations. As the briefing ended and pilots returned to simulation training that incorporated her atmospheric terrain mapping methods, Phoenix reflected on the transformation from dismissed expert to institutional authority for revolutionary procedures that had changed military aviation forever. She had proven that expertise could exist in unexpected places, that innovation often emerged from institutional outsiders who had time and motivation to develop knowledge that established thinking had failed to recognize, and that professional courage could transform theoretical analysis into life-saving operational capability. The impossible had become routine through systematic application of environmental knowledge that conventional training had never incorporated into pilot education. Phoenix's story demonstrated that sometimes the person everyone overlooks is exactly the person who understands what others cannot see. And sometimes the most valuable expertise develops outside established institutional channels. 10 years after revolutionizing military aviation with her atmospheric terrain mapping techniques, General Jessica Rodriguez received a phone call that would test every principle she had fought to establish. The voice on the secure line belonged to Admiral Catherine Hayes, commander of Joint Special Operations, and her words carried the weight of an impossible situation unfolding in real time. "Jessica, we have a crisis developing in the Arctic Circle," Admiral Hayes said without preamble. 3 separate rescue teams have failed to reach a downed research station due to unprecedented weather conditions. Conventional meteorological analysis shows the area is completely inaccessible by any known aircraft or ground vehicle. Phoenix set down her morning coffee and moved to the secure computer terminal in her Pentagon office, already beginning to analyze the tactical situation that was being described. "What's the nature of the emergency, Admiral?" "International Research Station with 47 personnel trapped after a massive ice shelf collapse," Hayes replied. "The structural damage is severe, and they're reporting multiple casualties requiring immediate medical evacuation. The window for survival is closing rapidly, but every conventional approach has been defeated by atmospheric conditions that our best meteorologists say are impossible to navigate." Phoenix pulled up satellite imagery of the Arctic Research Station while Hayes continued her briefing, immediately recognizing atmospheric patterns that conventional weather analysis would dismiss as random meteorological chaos. The complex interaction of Arctic air masses with sudden temperature variations was creating localized phenomena that standard aviation planning had no framework to address. "Admiral, send me all available meteorological data and terrain analysis for the affected area," Phoenix said, her mind already beginning to process the environmental factors that were preventing successful rescue operations. "The atmospheric conditions you're describing aren't random weather events. They follow systematic patterns that can be analyzed and circumvented." Within 30 minutes, Phoenix had assembled the most comprehensive environmental analysis of her career, correlating Arctic atmospheric data with geographical features that created predictable weather patterns, despite their apparent randomness. The failed rescue attempts had all followed conventional approaches that ignored the unique characteristics of polar atmospheric dynamics. The solution she developed required aircraft to navigate through what appeared to be completely impassable weather using techniques that extended her atmospheric terrain mapping methods into environmental conditions that no pilot had ever encountered. The approach would demand precision flying through wind corridors that existed for only minutes at a time, following routes that changed dynamically with atmospheric pressure variations. "Admiral Hayes," Phoenix said during their follow-up secure communication, "I have a viable approach plan, but it requires authorization for me to personally lead the rescue mission. The atmospheric navigation techniques needed for this operation can't be delegated or explained through conventional briefing procedures." The silence that followed suggested Admiral Hayes was processing the implications of authorizing a Pentagon general to pilot aircraft into conditions that had already defeated multiple rescue attempts by the military's most experienced pilots. "General Rodriguez, you're asking for authorization to risk the Pentagon's leading atmospheric warfare expert on a mission that conventional wisdom considers impossible," Hayes finally replied. "If we lose you, we lose institutional knowledge. That can't be replaced. Admiral, if we don't attempt this rescue, we lose 47 people who are depending on unconventional solutions to impossible problems." Phoenix responded with the same conviction that had driven her original challenge to institutional limitations 10 years earlier. Sometimes the most important missions are the ones that require personal commitment rather than theoretical guidance. The authorization came through Admiral Hayes' direct command authority, bypassing normal Pentagon approval procedures that would have delayed the rescue beyond the survival window for the trapped research personnel. Phoenix found herself once again preparing for operations that challenged every conventional assumption about what was possible under extreme environmental conditions. The flight to the Arctic staging area took her through increasingly severe weather conditions that validated her analysis of atmospheric patterns that conventional meteorological services had failed to predict or understand. The specialized helicopter she would pilot had been modified with advanced navigation systems, but success would depend entirely on her ability to read environmental conditions that existed beyond the capability of any instrument to detect. "Phoenix lead, this is Arctic Control," came the radio transmission from the forward operating base that had been established to coordinate rescue operations. "Weather conditions continue to deteriorate. 3 additional rescue attempts have been aborted due to zero visibility and extreme turbulence. Meteorological assessment indicates no improvement expected for 72 hours. Phoenix studied the atmospheric data streaming into her aircraft systems, while reviewing the routes she had calculated for navigating conditions that conventional analysis considered completely impassable. "Arctic Control, Phoenix lead. Beginning. Approach using alternative navigation procedures. Atmospheric phenomena are predictable and navigable using extended terrain mapping techniques." The flight into the Arctic storm system tested every principle of atmospheric navigation that Phoenix had developed during her career, requiring constant recalculation of wind patterns and visibility corridors that changed with each passing minute. The techniques that had revolutionized military aviation were being pushed to their absolute limits in environmental conditions that represented the most challenging flying of her life. Phoenix Lead, we're showing you entering weather conditions that have forced abort decisions from all previous rescue attempts, transmitted the concerned voice of the Arctic Control Operations Officer. Your aircraft signature is becoming intermittent on our tracking systems. Arctic Control, Phoenix Lead, Phoenix replied while navigating through atmospheric disturbances that would have been impossible to survive using conventional flying techniques. Visibility corridors exist within the storm system. Navigation is possible using microterrain analysis and dynamic atmospheric mapping. The rescue station appeared through the swirling snow and ice like a vision from another world. Its damaged structures testament to the catastrophic ice shelf collapse that had created the emergency requiring rescue operations that conventional wisdom had declared impossible. The landing approach required Phoenix to set her aircraft down in conditions that challenged every aspect of her flying experience, with wind patterns that shifted dynamically and visibility that changed from zero to marginal within seconds. The success of the rescue would depend entirely on her ability to maintain aircraft control while loading personnel, who were depending on her unconventional expertise for survival. Research Station Alpha, this is Phoenix Lead. She transmitted to the trapped personnel who had been waiting for rescue through multiple failed attempts. I'm on the ground and ready for immediate evacuation loading. Prepare casualties for transport according to medical priority. The evacuation proceeded with desperate efficiency, as research personnel who had resigned themselves to death were loaded into an aircraft that had reached them through atmospheric conditions that every previous rescue attempt had found impassable. Phoenix coordinated the medical loading while maintaining constant awareness of weather patterns that could close her navigation window without warning. Phoenix Lead, all personnel are aboard, reported Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the research station medical officer whose voice carried exhaustion mixed with disbelief that rescue had finally arrived. 47 souls depending on your ability to navigate back through conditions that prevented 3 previous rescue teams from reaching us. The return flight through the Arctic storm system required Phoenix to navigate using atmospheric terrain mapping techniques that she had never tested under such extreme conditions, following wind corridors that existed for only minutes before. Atmospheric pressure changes eliminated safe passage routes. Arctic Control, Phoenix Lead, she transmitted during the most challenging phase of the return flight. All research personnel extracted successfully. Navigating return route using dynamic atmospheric analysis. Estimated arrival in 43 minutes if weather patterns remain within predicted parameters. The successful completion of the Arctic rescue operation represented the ultimate validation of atmospheric terrain mapping as a tactical capability that could achieve mission success under environmental conditions that conventional aviation planning considered absolutely impossible to navigate safely. Phoenix landed at the Arctic staging base with 47 rescued research personnel, whose lives had depended on navigation techniques that extended far beyond anything taught in standard pilot training, proving once again that unconventional expertise could accomplish objectives that established procedures declared impossible. General Rodriguez, Admiral Hayes said during the secure communication that followed the rescue mission, "What you accomplished today demonstrates that atmospheric terrain mapping has applications far beyond military aviation. Your techniques just saved lives under conditions that every expert considered unsurvivable." The Arctic rescue became legendary within both military and civilian aviation circles, demonstrating that environmental challenges that appeared impossible could be overcome through systematic analysis and innovative application of atmospheric navigation principles that most pilots never learn to recognize or utilize. Phoenix returned to her Pentagon office knowing that her career had come full circle from dismissed expert to institutional authority to personal demonstration that the most important capabilities were often developed by individuals willing to challenge conventional limitations and prove that impossible was just another word for unanalyzed. The technique she had pioneered during her grounded status had evolved into standard curriculum taught worldwide. But the Arctic mission proved that innovation required constant evolution and personal commitment to pushing beyond established boundaries of what was considered possible under extreme conditions. Years later, when young pilots asked about the secret to successful atmospheric navigation, Phoenix would tell them that expertise meant understanding that environmental challenges were opportunities for tactical advantage rather than obstacles to mission accomplishment, and that sometimes the most important operations required personal courage to attempt what others considered impossible. Her story became proof that institutional dismissal often overlooked the most valuable expertise, that innovation emerged from unexpected sources, and that sometimes the person everyone underestimated was exactly the person who could see solutions that conventional thinking could never perceive or achieve. The impossible had become possible through systematic analysis, innovative application, and personal commitment to proving that atmospheric challenges could be overcome. When conventional limitations were replaced by unconventional expertise developed through dedication to understanding what others considered unknowable. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.